Chapter 9. The Crises of 1807 to 1826. The French invasion in October 1807 under Jean Andoche Junot culminated with the occupation of Lisbon on the 30th of November, after which he became governor of Portugal. Unlike with the Spanish invasions of 1580 and 1762, there had been no resistance. However, Junot had found the advance overland from Salamanca difficult. The British had sent a fleet instructed to escort John, the regent on behalf of Maria I, to Brazil or to attack Lisbon if the government surrendered to the French. Under pressure from both sides, John finally decided to accept British protection, and he and a large entourage of about 15,000 people left for Brazil, much to the surprise of the public. The confused Maria was not sure where she was going. Although the lengthy journey in this case was far more arduous, this was on the pattern of the flight of several other rulers, those of Naples and Savoy-Piedmont to Sicily and Sardinia respectively under the cover of the British fleet, and Louis XVIII of France and William V of Orange to Britain. Delayed by contrary winds, John was unable to sail until the advancing French troops were on the very outskirts of the city. The plan itself was old. Antonio Vieira had proposed it to John IV in the 1640s because of the Spanish threat. Brazil was the most valuable part of the Portuguese Atlantic Empire. The conquest of Portugal was intended by Napoleon to cement the 1806 Berlin and Milan decrees that sought to establish the commercial quarantine of Britain and her goods, and thus weaken her economy and war effort. However, Napoleon's attempt to place his brother Joseph on the throne of Spain, a misconceived move that would have increased French control over Spanish resources, led to a popular uprising in Spain in 1808. The British exploited the situation with an expedition under Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, that landed in Portugal at Mondego Bay over the course of the 1st to the 5th of August. On the 21st of August 1808, this army defeated attacking French forces under Junot at Vimeiro. Wellesley had sheltered his lines of infantry from the French cannon by deploying them behind the crest of the ridge. He placed his riflemen forward in open order down the slope and used them to prevent the French skirmishers, who advanced before the columns, from disrupting the British lines. The poorly coordinated advancing columns were halted by British infantry and cannon fire and driven back by downhill charges. Wellesley was then superseded by superior officers who did not wish to push on against the French. By the Convention of Sintra on the 30th of August, they agreed with the French that the latter evacuate Portugal, but be returned to France in British ships, and be then free to resume hostilities. The British also agreed to ship the French baggage and booty. This agreement led to a public storm in Britain, and the commanders were recalled to face a court of inquiry in London. Instead, Sir John Moore became the commander. Napoleon, meanwhile, responded to the crisis in Spain by intervening in person, entering Madrid on the 4th of December 1808. Instructed to provide support for his Spanish opponents, Moore advanced into Spain from Lisbon, only, in the face of larger advancing French forces, to have to retreat, eventually to Coruña, from which the British troops could be shipped to Britain. Napoleon's plan for an advance on Lisbon had been thrown into disarray, but, having pursued Moore to Coruña, from which the British were evacuated, Marshal Jean de Dieu Nicolas Soult then moved south to destroy the British forces in Portugal. These forces were garrisoning Lisbon under Lieutenant General Sir John Francis Cradock, a cautious commander, and understandably so in the aftermath of Moore's failure. He felt that evacuation might be necessary. The usually vigorous Soult stormed Oporto on the 27th of March 1809, but fresh British troops under Wellesley were sent to Portugal, and he assumed command of the British army there. On the 12th of May, Wellesley made a surprise crossing of the Douro, fought off counterattacks, and captured Oporto. This is a triumph that is commemorated in the city by the statue of a lion crushing an eagle. This was a well-executed offensive action that was helped by poor dispositions and slow responses on the part of Soult, who had wrongly thought he had seized all the boats that could be used for a crossing. Soult's force then retreated northeast, plundering and causing devastation, for example burning down much of the town of Amarante, where the townspeople had defended the bridge when the French searched for a river crossing. From this devastation, the burned-out ruins of an old manor house can be seen close to the railway station. Such destruction was commonplace with French campaigning, and helps explain why recent attempts to praise Napoleon are seriously misplaced. Another British force had been deployed to block a French advance on Lisbon from the east along the Tagus. However, the French, under Marshal Claude-Victor Perrin, short of food near Alcantara, halted their advance before they could reach the British force after the news of Wellesley's victory at Oporto. Indeed, it was the British that had wrecked the inflexible French strategy, one also hit by poor logistics. In general, the French assumed that they could seize the supplies they required, a practice that was militarily rash and politically inopportune, as well as being destructive. In the winter of 1809 to 1810, the end of war with Austria, the War of the Fourth Coalition, led to the dispatch of French reinforcements to Iberia, although France initially concentrated on its Spanish opponents. Given command of the army of Portugal, a post he tried to refuse, Marshal André Masséna was then ordered to conquer that country. The threat of French attack led Wellesley, who had been elevated to the peerage as Viscount Wellington in August 1809, to fall back in 1810, avoiding battle with the far larger French army. His strategy was one of defence in depth, and he was given added time when Napoleon ordered Masséna, against the wishes of the latter, who wanted to march direct on Lisbon, first to capture the strong border fortresses of Ciudad Rodrigo in Spain and Almeida in Portugal. Both fell, the second after the powder magazine was blown up on the 27th of August, but the sieges delayed Masséna. The envious Napoleon also provided Masséna with far fewer troops than he had promised. Rather than withdrawing to Britain by sea, Wellington was convinced that Portugal could be held, and developed a strong fallback fortified position, 2 lines of forts and natural obstacles, the lines of Torres-Vedras, resting on major waterlines, to cover nearby Lisbon from the north. Despite the covering embrace of vegetation, it is still possible to follow important parts of these defences, notably the redoubts of São Vicente. There was a third line protecting the fortress of São Julião de Barra on the shore of the Tagus west of Lisbon, in case the British needed to protect a rushed evacuation. Portugal was invaded by Masséna's army on the 15th of September. Wellington chose to resist Masséna's advancing forces further forward in a good defensive position at Busaco on the 27th of September 1810. The French found the British and Portuguese drawn up on a ridge, and their poorly planned attacks were repulsed, with nearly 5,000 casualties, half of them Portuguese. A monument marks the victory. The Busaco Palace Hotel has tiles depicting the battle, and there is a military museum nearby devoted to the war. However, the position was then outflanked, and Wellington fell back on the lines of Torres-Vedras. The French reached the lines on the 12th of October, but they were too strong to breach. The French lacked a siege train and sufficient troops, and the devastated countryside meant that the French came to suffer serious malnutrition, just as the Spaniards had done when they invaded in 1762. Thanks to scorched earth policies, Captain John Hill, a British soldier, recorded, "The country is dreadfully ravaged. I saw nothing except a few pigeons left about the villages, the floors and rafters taken out either to burn or make huts. All the inhabitants had retired before our army, so that what a few months before had been a fine country is literally now a desert." Wellington focused on strengthening his position, denying Masséna the opportunity to fight a battle. Probing French moves failed. Napoleon thought that the British Navy did not have the capacity to supply the 1 million people within the lines, but he was wrong. Napoleon, however, was happy to see British forces tied down in Lisbon, and also thought that the Prince Regent might give up the struggle. The British officers, such as Wellington's second-in-command, Major General Sir Brent Spencer, who doubted the viability of Wellington's plan of defence, were also wrong. Wellington had a mastery of logistics. The winter did its damage, not least by greatly exacerbating French supply difficulties, and on the 5th of March 1811, after very heavy losses to disease and hunger, Masséna began to retreat. What in effect had been a large-scale siege of Lisbon by land had failed. Masséna was followed by Wellington, who launched harassing attacks. To the north, Almeida was besieged by the British, and Masséna's attempts to relieve it were successfully blocked at Fuentes del Ñoro in early May. Almeida then fell. It remains an interesting fortress site, with interpretation helped by a museum. Masséna was dismissed by a typically unforgiving Napoleon. In 1811, 1812 and 1813, Wellington invaded Spain, with the Portuguese providing an important part of his manpower. A British officer, William Beresford, who had occupied Madeira in 1807, had been given supreme command of the Portuguese army in March 1809, and he totally reorganised it on British lines. Wellington had turned down the role. The Portuguese repeatedly fought hard, as at Busaco, 1810, and Albuera, 1811, and in the Battle of Salamanca in 1812, a key victory, 1/3 of the Allied casualties were Portuguese. They also fought well at the crucial Battle of Vitoria, another key victory in 1813. These Portuguese forces accompanied Wellington on his invasion of France in 1814. Wellington regarded them as better soldiers than the Spaniards, and as better disciplined. The war, however, left much of Portugal devastated, and with heavy civilian casualties. The French invaders had inflicted much damage. Many civilians died as a result of their exactions, which included a massacre when Beja was sacked in 1808. There was also damage to monuments. Thus, in the monastery of Alcobaça, the tombs of Peter and Inish were damaged in 1811 by French troops seeking booty. In addition, agriculture had been badly hit during the war, which caused hunger. Moreover, trade was very much affected by British competition. Indeed, British economic and political influence was greatly resented, as was the army being under Beresford. Political disaffection came to the fore on the death of Maria, when John VI came to the throne in March 1816. Aware of his wealth and position in Brazil, and not keen on another Atlantic crossing, he remained in Brazil. A regency was established in Portugal, and the army was still under Beresford. As with the Carnation Revolution in 1974, disaffection in the army was crucial in what became a revolutionary situation. In opposition, liberal agitation focused on the idea of calling a Cortes, which had not met since 1698. Unlike with Parliament in Britain, the government, thanks to Brazilian gold, had not needed to call a Cortes. This agitation and the turn to a Cortes were encouraged by the example of liberalism in Spain. In 1817, a group of revolutionaries under Gomes Freire de Andrade, who had served under Napoleon, was betrayed and executed. This unpopular step contributed to the liberal revolution of 1820, which, on the pattern of Spanish developments, broke out in Oporto on the 24th of August, rapidly spreading elsewhere. The revolutionaries, who were opposed to the continued influence of Beresford, called for the return of John from Brazil, for a constitutional monarchy with a Cortes modelled on the Spanish Constitution of 1812, and for the reduction of Brazil from the status of a kingdom within the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil and the Algarve, a status granted by John in December 1815, to that of a colony. Without consulting John, they formed a government and called a Cortes that met in 1821. This led to a council of regency to exercise power in the name of John. Political prisoners were freed, and John was pressed to return to Portugal. In accordance with the liberal agenda, the Inquisition was abolished in 1821, and religious orders were banned. Censorship was also banned until 1823, when the first law establishing the freedom of the press was passed. In response, the indecisive John returned to Portugal in July 1821, leaving his talented son Peter as regent of Brazil, and the constitution was approved in 1822. However, this revolution and the policies of the Cortes were unpopular in Brazil, which in turn declared its independence on the 7th of September 1822, Peter becoming the first emperor of Brazil. A war against the Portuguese forces in Brazil began in 1822 and lasted until 1824. The Portuguese forces were in the northern provinces and in the capital cities south of Rio. British naval officers and seamen recruited by Brazil played a key role in isolating Portuguese garrisons and enabling Brazil to win the war. In 1823, the Portuguese were forced to leave Salvador da Bahia, and the Brazilian squadron also captured Maranhão and Belém do Pará. Portugal was obliged to recognise Brazil's independence in 1825, with a British diplomat, Charles Stewart, playing a key role. Brazilian independence was not inevitable, but highly contingent. Revolts in Brazil were spreading, while the collapse of Spanish America was an important background. The conflict in Brazil between the supporters of Portuguese rule and opponents was shorter than that in some parts of Spanish America, notably what became Venezuela, let alone in Spanish America as a whole, but was longer than in some other parts. As with Spain and the policies of the Cortes there, the shifts in Portugal's policy affected the situation in Brazil. In the outcome, many of the connections in the Luso-Atlantic world, Luso meaning related to Portugal derives from the name of the Roman province Lusitania, notably those between Angola and Brazil, remained strong. However, the Portuguese world had been radically transformed by the loss of Brazil. The last years of John VI's reign saw not only the loss of Brazil, but also growing instability in Portugal, although nothing to match Spain, which faced civil war and French invasion in 1823. That year, opposition to liberalism began in Portugal, with a key role being played by John's second son, Prince Miguel, the absolutist or the traditionalist. He was encouraged by his Spanish mother, Queen Carlota Joaquina, long a political opponent of John's, as well as being an unfaithful wife. Miguel organised a military demonstration, the Villa Francada, and forced forward the restitution of what he presented as his father's inalienable rights, that is, absolutist rights. In response to this pressure, John, who was personally sympathetic to liberalism, suspended the 1822 constitution and, under pressure, agreed to accept absolutism. However, the relationship with Miguel broke down in 1824. Backed by the British and French envoys, John then regained power in May and exiled Miguel. John, in turn, promised and did sketch around 1825 a constitutional charter that would eventually assure a transition into a moderate liberalism, one separate from the Vintismo of the 1820 liberal revolution, and perhaps mirroring the Louis XVIII monarchy in France. Having recognized Brazilian independence, John restored the right of succession of his son Peter, the Emperor of Brazil, and also named a regency council under his daughter, the Infanta Isabel Maria, to govern the country between his death and the return of Peter. This offered the prospect of restoring the link between Portugal and Brazil, albeit as a dual monarchy. When John died on the 10th of March 1826, a course for the stable future appeared set. It was not to be. A visitor in 1821 to 1823. Having accompanied her husband Alexander to Portugal, Marianne Bailey published her account in 1824. Her impression was mixed. Staying in the outskirts of Lisbon, she complained of filth and bad smells in the streets and the indolence of the inhabitants, adding, "You are suffocated by the steams of fried fish, rancid oil, garlic, etc. at every turn, mingled with the fetid effluvia of decayed vegetables, stale provisions, and other horrors. The armies of fleas, bugs, mosquitoes, and other vermin are too numerous to be conceived, even in idea." She was more positive about Portuguese courtesy, roasted chestnuts, and a sort of white light wine sold here, which we thought almost as refreshing and as excellent as hock.